Hello, cooking enthusiasts. In this week's video, we are going to talk about Shokupan, aka Hokkaido or Japanese milk bread. If you are unfamiliar with this, I would say it's essentially the version of a really soft white sandwich bread. Among all the variations you see in milk bread recipes, I would say the distinguishing factor is a hydrated starch paste. What you just saw was one version of the technique of combining just boiled water with a specific ratio of flour. There's also techniques where you combine milk or water with a little bit of flour cold and then cook it all together. Both of these might be considered a tangzong, and there is even still another technique where flour and water is combined and just left refrigerated overnight. The end result is always allowing this portion of the flour to absorb a lot more liquid than it normally would than just combining normally, so that this portion of the dough and the overall mixture essentially behaves like it's slightly lower in hydration. Next, we turn to a little modification I made to this style of recipe, which is to incorporate a sourdough biga. This is a form of relatively stiff pre-ferment that is sometimes flour, water, and a small portion of the dried yeast, but in this case was flour, water, and sourdough starter. I just like this technique because I find it's a good way to wake up my sourdough starter after not baking for a while, and similar to the Tangzong, gives a jump start in hydrating some of the flour and developing gluten. I started fermenting the biga roughly 8 hours at room temperature before making this bread, but you could do other timetables. And the first major step is just bringing together the tangzong and the biga with a little bit of the remaining flour, followed by adding the rest of the flour. Also, besides the bread flour in the biga, all of the other flour is actually 00 flour, which is a tip I got from Chinese Cooking Demystified's milk bread. While most bread recipes select flour based on protein content or maybe flavor, 00 flour is milled really, really fine, which allows it to hydrate faster. So, gram for gram with other flour, it sort of behaves more friendly in high hydration situations. Now we start adding the wet ingredients. First, 1 egg white for a little bit of added protein-based structure, but the primary for the recipe is, of course, buttermilk. And like with my last video, this is a true buttermilk, that being the byproduct of making cultured butter. So like with my last video, you could obviously substitute a store-bought buttermilk, a kefir, or a whole unstrained yogurt. And we did potentially add the liquid a little too quickly. So definitely learn from our mistakes and go a little slower if you try this. After mixing for a few minutes, we incorporated the salt, which is also going to slightly reinforce and tighten up the structure. Because we added liquid too quickly, the dough was looking pretty lumpy for a while, so we just had to rely on the machine to power through. And it's okay because you want a good amount of gluten development with this style of bread. Once we had something that was a little smoother, we start incorporating the fat into the recipe, which is pretty standard technique for any type of enriched bread. Of course, in this case, we are using my homemade ghee, which is cultured butter that has been browned and then clarified. And I think it's an important point to mention that the bread was not the original idea, but the cultured butter and the ghee was. So it's about starting with a project that has a really wide range of uses, like the cultured butter and ghee, and then utilizing the byproducts and a little bit of the main product in interesting ways. So now we are jumping ahead a little bit because the fat was cold and took a little while to fully incorporate. So the final ingredient to add is a little bit of sugar, which in this case is pure lactose to carry on the milk theme, but that is not necessary and could be regular sugar. The sugar is last because it slightly weakens gluten and just makes the entire dough a little more slack. But you can see that overall things are really coming together. It is very smooth, very stretchy, wrapping around the dough hook and sticking much more to itself than the vessel. And from there, we gave it a few hours at room temperature before wrapping and refrigerating. We jump ahead to the next day where we are portioning the dough, dividing it into three primary portions of 250 grams, and the extra dough will be used for some breadcrumb experiments. Now, just because of my dad's schedule, these portions went back in the fridge until the next morning before the final shaping, but we are actually missing the footage of that shaping. But the basic idea of the shaping is that the three balls were rolled into vague large rectangles before being rolled up and placed next to each other in the loaf pan. But even in this clip where we are just dividing the dough, I think you can tell that it's behaving a lot nicer than a normal 80% hydration dough would be. This is because both the tangzong, the choice of flour, and the general thorough gluten development. So now this is day 3 of the recipe. Again, not necessary. It could be just a 2-day recipe. But the bread loaf has been shaped. It was given a few hours to begin proofing and then was resting in the refrigerator. Because I have the ANOVA oven, I am beginning the baking at 200 Celsius with 100% steam. That went for about 8 minutes before turning the temperature down to 175 Celsius and 0% steam, as well as releasing the steam. And I do give some alternate baking instructions in the written recipes. We checked the internal temperature after around 15 minutes at this second temperature, and it needed just a little bit longer. After another 5 minutes, we were hitting just around 90 degrees Celsius internal, which is sort of borderline cooked, but it worked fine for this slightly enriched bread. And that brings us to the end of the recipe. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this bread turned out. It was a little overproofed, and the shaping could have been a bit better, but that just takes some practice. In general, we got the desired texture of soft and fluffy, but with some substantial chew once you got into it. I really enjoyed the added flavor from the buttermilk and the sourdough for what is usually, again, a pretty plain white bread. I feel the extra acidic note played really well when making it into a fried katsu sando. So in general, in the future, we're just going to play around with the size and shape of the actual bread, play around with improving my fresh breadcrumb experiment, and maybe even develop this recipe into a donut or some other fun offshoots. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.